Elizabeth Masterson sits in a tranquil garden, seeming to be totally at peace in the beauty and quiet of her surroundings. But then a random voice snaps her back into the moment, and it turns out she isn't in a garden at all, but a hospital. Elizabeth is a surgeon. We follow her for a few hours of her day, catching an insight into the jam-packed schedule that she keeps. It's all go, go, go for her, with little time for breaks, or a love life, as we find out when the other female doctors complain about how hard it is to balance work and personal relationships. Then they rub it in when they claim they're jealous of Elizabeth, as she doesn't have to worry about having a boyfriend. Lucky her. Not that she doesn't try. Her sister, Abby, calls and reminds her that she has a blind date tonight, one that her sister has set up. She makes a point in detailing how busy Elizabeth is, that she needs to find balance in her life. Elizabeth doesn't seem to agree, but it's all for a good reason. As her shift nears its end, her boss reveals that he was so impressed with Elizabeth that he's going to give her the promotion she has been working towards. It came down to her and another doctor, Brett, but she earned it. Excited now and given the rest of the night off, Elizabeth hurries to her sister's house so she can meet with her blind date. But she's so excited and overjoyed at the promotion that when a song comes on the radio, she takes her eyes off the road to turn it up, only to be sideswiped by an oncoming truck. David Abbott is apartment hunting with his realtor. It's pretty clear that David isn't in a good space, and despite how lovely all the apartments are, none are for him. All he seems to be concerned about is a couch. The day is drawing to an end, and it looks as if David isn't going to find anything. But then a random flyer catches the wind and floats into David twice. It's an advertisement for an apartment across the road. His realtor thinks it's a waste of time, but David insists on checking it out. The apartment's beautiful, spacious, amazing views, a private rooftop access, and a comfortable couch. The only downside is that it's a month-by-month rental. His realtor tries to talk him out of it, but David doesn't care. He's taking it. Alone and moved in, David settles himself onto the couch and starts to drink. And drink a little more. There's clearly something wrong with David, and he's still getting past it. The only time he does get up is to grab another beer, but when he returns to the living room, Elizabeth's standing there. The two scream, both as surprised as each other. Cinema recap here. We've got a little challenge that'll take 5 seconds, and it will change your life forever. You ready? All you gotta do is like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and you'll receive 10 free years of good luck. It's as simple as that. David asks what Elizabeth's doing here. She asks the same. He tries to explain that he lives here, but she tells him that she does. David thinks that maybe it's a rental scam, but Elizabeth is more concerned about the fact that he isn't using a coaster for his drink. She rants at him for being a slob, but when she walks around the corner and into the kitchen, she suddenly disappears. David has no idea what's going on. He looks about the apartment, sure that she's somewhere, but she's completely vanished. Later that night, David's taking a shower. He climbs out and unfogs the mirror, but Elizabeth's back. She screams at him to move out and he freaks. When he looks back, she's gone. It's about now that he realizes something's wrong. David meets his best friend Jack for a coffee. Tries to explain to Jack that he's seeing things. A woman to be exact, one who isn't there. Jack is also David's physiatrist, and he's convinced that David is making this up as a means to cope. It's suggested that David is recently single, and Jack tries his best to get David to move on and rejoin the world of the living. David doesn't agree. The next night, David's taking a nap on his bed when Elizabeth appears again. She scolds him for both sleeping in her bed and for not having moved out yet. David, convinced she's not real, tries to ignore her, but she doesn't go away. She sits on his bed and explains that she lives here, that she's real, but then she sees that he's moved her picture off the table. Furious, she tries to call the police, but her hand goes right through the phone. Scared now, Elizabeth hurries around the corner and again disappears. Desperate now, David finds himself in a seance store, where he starts to look into the paranormal. It's now that the store's owner, Daryl, offers David a hand. He gives him a bunch of books to read and sends him home. That night, David lights a few candles and reads from one of the books, trying to get Elizabeth to come out again. She refuses, so he baits her by threatening to put a mug of coffee on the table without a coaster. Elizabeth appears to stop him. David knows that Elizabeth is dead, and he tries to convince her that she is. She won't hear it, even though he's speaking good sense. David tries to approach her, and Elizabeth backs up, refusing to listen. But then she walks through the kitchen table, completely through it, as if she's a ghost. David shouts at her that she's dead, and she attacks him, but her arms go right through him. Elizabeth wants him out of the apartment. As David watches TV, she lies in front of it and sings show tunes at the top of her lungs to distract him. Furious, David tells her that he was being nice, but now he's done. He does everything he can to get rid of her. He hires a priest to bless the apartment. He even hires Ghostbusters to try and capture her. Finally, he invites Daryl over, hoping that there's something he can do. Daryl can sense Elizabeth in the apartment, but he can feel the hostility coming off her. And he suggests to David that he just move. It's all he can do. David won't have it. Daryl mentions that this might have something to do with David's ex and Elizabeth. Thinking this is a weakness of David's, latches on and starts to insult him for being dumb. Furious, David storms out, and that's when Elizabeth realizes she went too far. She finds David on the roof and apologizes about what she said. It's implied that David's ex didn't dump him, but that it was his wife and she died. Elizabeth then asks David if he wants to talk about it, but he's still angry and he storms off. David heads to a nearby bar where Jack is drinking with some women. Elizabeth follows him in, trying to convince David not to drink, that he doesn't need to. David won't listen, ordering himself a scotch. Refusing to be ignored, Elizabeth takes over David's body and, after a little wrestling, forces him back out of the bar. The two enemies have reached an impasse. Elizabeth apologizes for what she did, but she's also starting to accept the fact that she might be dead. David tries to console her. Maybe she isn't dead. Elizabeth knows that if she can just find out who she was, then maybe she'll know what happened to her. David agrees to help. After a little convincing, David starts by knocking on every door in his building and asking if they knew the previous tenant. Sadly, no one does, which leads Elizabeth to think that maybe she had no friends at all. One tenant, however, Katrina, likes the look of David and invites him in to fix her window. It's clear what she means, and David, under the scornful eye of Elizabeth, flees. It's when David's rushing to find a bottle opener that he stumbles upon the next set of leads. The first is for a dry cleaning store, and although the owner does remember her, he tells David that she was pleasant, but dull and sad and lonely. This upsets Elizabeth, who refuses to believe it. The next lead is an address, but when they knock on the front door, it's answered by an older man who freaks out and tells David to meet him later on. It's suggested that he was having an affair with Elizabeth behind his wife's back. This only upset Elizabeth more. As they walk down the street, Elizabeth spots a restaurant she recognizes. She never used to go in, but she knows that she always wanted to. While inside, a man suddenly collapses on the floor, and when the customers shout out for a doctor, Elizabeth senses that she knows what to do. She orders David to help, and with her whispering in his ear, she walks him through the steps needed to save the man's life. It involves cutting him open and shoving a pourer into the wound to release air. It's messy, dirty work, but it saves the man's life, and it confirms in Elizabeth that she must have been a doctor. Together, they head to the nearest hospital, and Elizabeth knows right away that she used to work there. But then David asks about her, and is sent upstairs to where Elizabeth's old colleague explains that she was in an accident 3 months earlier. As if on instinct, Elizabeth is pulled through the hospital into a room where she finds her actual body in a coma. Now that they know who and where she is, they try and wake her up. First, Elizabeth lies down in her body, hoping to reattach. When that does nothing, David strokes Elizabeth's hand, which the ghost Elizabeth feels. It's a good sign, but it's not enough. It's then that the doctor returns and tells David he has to leave. He realizes that this means Elizabeth won't be coming back to the apartment with him, and although he claimed to want her out of his life, the goodbye is strained and sad. Both are clearly a little upset by the fact that they'll never see one another again. Elizabeth remains at the hospital. After doing a little snooping, she's pulled back to the room when her sister Abby and her 2 nieces arrive. She's thrilled to see him. But then Dr. Brett pops into the room and asks to speak with Abby. It turns out that Elizabeth had signed a form stating that if she was ever in a coma, to be taken off life support. Brett explains that she's been kept on it on account of her position at the hospital, but it's now up to Abby to make that choice. she has to decide if she's gonna pull her own sister off life support and kill her once and for all. Back at his apartment, David's about to eat dinner alone when Katrina rings his doorbell. She explains that she locked herself out and wants to use his phone to call a locksmith. He lets her in, and once he does, she refuses to leave. She talks and talks and talks and talks. The conversation obnoxious, and not to David's taste. Then she tells David she wants to show him something, and she goes into his bedroom. David has no idea what to do, and it's made worse when Elizabeth suddenly appears. She pretends that she's okay with David sleeping with Katrina, although it's obvious she cares. But David claims that he doesn't want to, even though he'd be crazy to say no. Katrina strips off and appears in the hallway mostly naked, trying to coax David into the room with her. Elizabeth tells him it's none of her business and that he should just do it. She then leaves him alone. While David couldn't sleep with Katrina, he sends her home and goes to the rooftop where he finally tells Elizabeth what happened to his wife. It was a few years ago, and everything was perfect between them when suddenly she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died instantly. As much as her death killed David, the fact that he couldn't do anything to help her was what hurt the most. She's gone, and he didn't even say goodbye. The next day, David gets a call from his realtor. Turns out that his monthly lease is over, and that the owners of the apartment are happy to extend it permanently. This should be good news, but it means that Elizabeth's sister is going to take her off life support. They realize they have no choice but to go and speak with her and try to. They're not sure, but they have to do something. David goes to see Abby, and he and Elizabeth decide to tell her what David knows, that Elizabeth is a ghost and with him right now. But he was supposed to go when her kids were out of the house, but they come screaming into the room as soon as he arrives. He switches strategy and claims that he was a patient of Elizabeth's, and because he knows of how much of a fighter she is, he wants Abby to agree to not pull the plug and give her a little more time. Unfortunately, Abby tells David that it's too late, that she signed the papers already. With no choice, David reveals everything, trying to explain that Elizabeth is right there now with him. Naturally, Abby doesn't believe him, and then chases him out of the house with a butcher's knife. Elizabeth thinks that it's over, and there's nothing they can do. But David has one final idea. He takes her to see Daryl, hoping that he might have an answer to how they can put Elizabeth back in her body. But Daryl tells David that he's asking the wrong question. The right question is, why did Elizabeth come to you in the first place? Figure that out, and they might be able to save her. It's their last night together. Overcome with emotion, David finally reveals his feelings for Elizabeth. Despite himself, despite how strange it all might sound, he's falling for her. Maybe he's even in love with her. And then Elizabeth tells him that she's falling for him too. She wants to kiss him to know how that might feel, but she can't. And seeing as it's her last night, they do the only thing they can do. They climb in bed together, close their eyes, and touch hands. So connected and utterly in love, for that moment, it almost looks like they can feel one another. The next morning arrives, and David still refuses to give up. He recruits his friend Jack, forcing him to help out. As to the plan, well, they're going to kidnap Elizabeth's body and hide it until they figure out what to do. The plan goes terribly. Although they arrive early, Brett does too. When they hear him coming, David runs out to distract them and try and trick him into leaving. But when he doesn't budge, David punches him in the face and knocks him down. Then, with Jack in tow, the two take Elizabeth's body and flee. It's a chase. Security's onto him. Jack tackles one to the ground. David pushes Elizabeth through the hospital, becoming more desperate by the second. But then he realizes that Jack accidentally pulled out her breathing tube. No matter what they do now, she's gonna die. But still, David doesn't give up. Calling to her to wake, he tries giving her mouth to mouth. It looks like it isn't gonna work. But then her breathing starts again. Her heart begins to beat and Elizabeth wakens from her coma. David can't believe it, leaning over her, expecting to see the look of recognition in her eyes. Only, Elizabeth has no idea who he is. He tries to touch at her hand, hoping this will remind her, but it's no good. She has no idea who he is. It's a few days later, and Elizabeth has moved back into her apartment. Something's different about it, but she doesn't know what. She wanders upstairs to the roof where she finds it overflowing with a beautiful garden. She can't believe it. That's when David steps out. He tells her he isn't going to hang around, but he wanted her to have this as a final gift. She asks him why he looks so familiar. He tells her he used to know her, again, hoping she'll remember. She doesn't, and asks him for the keys to her place. When their hands touch, flashes from the time as a ghost flood Elizabeth's memory. She tells David to stop, thinking that she might remember him. In a desperate plea to help remember her, he pulls her in for a kiss. Just like that, she remembers everything. The two kiss passionately on the rooftop. A final shot of Daryl at work, seemingly watching the two kiss from above. He says righteous, and the screen goes black. This was a recap of the film Just Like Heaven, produced by DreamWorks Pictures and released in 2005. Directed by Mark Waters, it stars Mark Ruffalo and Reese Witherspoon. If you were a ghost for a day, who would you haunt? Tell us with the hashtag CinemaRecap in the comments.